Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of American Grit with myself, Tim Jensen. We have a special guest for you today. Her name is Jessica Lauren Walton. You may know her, maybe not, but you're going to learn about the subject matter that she's an expert in today, and that is the idea of moral injury and the practices around moral injury in specifically the combat veteran space or the veteran space in general. So, we've got a lot to talk about. It's going to be a action-packed, well, maybe not action-packed, but it's going to be full of great information that we want to, again, give you information because information is power. We're leading up to September, which is Suicide Prevention Month. And we think this is a great opportunity to have a really unique conversation with a subject matter expert that comes from a very, very astute background. She's a communication strategist, a video producer, a writer, and she works in the defense sector. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our friend, Jessica Lauren Walton. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like we've had a bit of a psychic moment without you realizing, because about a year ago, I was just like randomly scrolling on Instagram and I saw pictures of San Antonio. It was probably like the Riverwalk, and I was like, I really want to go there. I want an excuse. I want someone to invite me to San Antonio. And then we met. And thank you for inviting me to San Antonio. You're like my fairy godmother now.
Oh, see, the universe works in strange ways, and I've come to understand don't ever mess with the universe.
Yeah.
But welcome to San Antonio. We're glad to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell your bona fides. What makes Jessica Lauren Walton an expert in the field of moral injury? But more importantly, what is moral injury for those that may not understand what it is?
Yeah, so moral injury is the psychological distress or shame that somebody feels when they've either participated or witnessed an event that goes against their moral compass. And it's not a new term, but at the same time, it's not a term that a lot of people have heard of. So the term was, it originates from Dr. Jonathan Shea. He was a staff psychiatrist at the Veteran Affairs Office. So this was a term he coined in the 1990s after doing extensive research on psychological trauma from Vietnam veterans. So I have his book here. I don't know where to point it, right? I like to show off the books. And it's very interesting because when Achilles in Vietnam, so he actually looks at the Iliad, right? Like one of the oldest war stories. And he shows us kind of like what has changed and what hasn't. Like technology obviously has changed, but human nature hasn't, right? But why now? Like, why are we talking about this term now, right? It has to do with the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 because of the moral impact that it had on the veteran community. Yeah. And so a lot of people still don't know the term. Even in the military, it's not a familiar term. But because of the psychological impact, that can come from moral injury, depression, anxiety, feelings of isolation, suicidal ideation, it's definitely something important that we should be talking about. So thank you for, having me on your podcast so we can start to get people more familiar with the term.
Yeah, absolutely. It's extraordinarily important, right? We just wrapped up about 20 years worth of combat here in the United States. Our forces being deployed around the world in support of global war on terror. And with that, there's well over 4.5 million veterans that have, participated in the global war on terrorism. A significant amount of those have been boots on the ground, traded rounds with the enemy, and have been asked to do and participate in some really horrible things, right? And when we think about, the humanity of warfare, right? We live in, fortunately, a period much different than our parents and even our grandparents, right? We weren't around when they were using chemical warfare in World War I, right? We weren't around when they were, most of us weren't around, rather, when the Germans were, blitzkrieging across Europe, right? So we haven't seen that level of combat. But what we have seen is the evils of what humans can do to each other, right? I remember myself specifically, cutting men down from rafters that we had worked with previously. But the local fighters in the insurgency, found that they were, sympathizers to Americans and killed them. Right? A lot of us are experiencing that, and a lot of us, come from that Christian background of those ideals of saying "Thou shalt not kill," and we will be raised with these certain moral, compass that it's ingrained into us. And
it's easy to say that and to live by that in the civilian world, but things get a lot more complicated in the battle zone.
Yeah, absolutely. So, please, I'd love to hear more about that, in the sense of like, what is really the impetus of the moral injury? Like, what is the root cause analysis, right? We could talk about all the superficial things, but what is the root?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I want to frame this whole conversation around moral injury like almost counterintuitively as something that is positive, because it shows that we still have a conscience. It shows that we as a security community want to do the right thing, even when doing the right thing can be complicated. I mean, to give you an example, by contrast, a terrorist who blows up a bus full of school children and then hands out candy to celebrate afterwards, he's not suffering from moral injury because he's a crappy loser, right?
Right.
And I mean, so that's kind of, I don't know if you call it the paradox of having a conscience. Having a conscience can be painful, right? Because you do something or you witness something that like burns your soul, right? And I mean, look, the work that we do in the security field, especially the people who are on the front lines, our war fighters, our first responders, it's holy work. And at the same time, it burns the soul, right?
Yeah.
And so I just want to frame it that way, that if somebody who's listening to this is saying, wow, I recognize myself as having moral injury, it means that you're a good person. It means that you actually have a conscience and that you still care to do the right thing.
Yeah. And, again, I remember moments in Iraq, like when, it was chaotic, right? It was the Wild West, 2004, 2005.
Yeah.
And, there were moments in time where, the Marines, we were all together and we're asking ourselves, like, what the hell are we doing? Like, you're getting pushed to the brink of madness in these circumstances. And, to your point, you're just seeing just incredible amounts of violence that you have never even experienced. Like, we get this whole Hollywood exposure, right? And the fictional aspects of, hey, it's cool to be in a gunfight, right? Everybody chimes in, especially the military community, like, oh, Heat, that's like the most realistic gun battle in all Hollywood production. But it's cool. It's cool to look at that. But when you're in it, it's a much different circumstance.
Hollywood is storytelling, and storytelling is showing very specific parts of life, right? And they show the parts, the action shots, maybe a little bit of the grief or the injury afterwards, but very little of that. Do they really show, for example, even what comes before that, all the painful training that goes into becoming a Marine, for example? Do they show what it's like when somebody is sitting alone, coming back to the civilian world and feeling isolated? They don't usually show that, right? And that there's a whole other world that, Hollywood doesn't necessarily show.
Yeah, right. They showed it in
the less glamorous
Rambo,
stuff.
Right? I mean, they painted that movie out to be something else. But
so I'll tell you a little bit about my background and how I became, involved in this work, the wider, mental health advocacy, area in the security field. So I'm a communication strategist and video producer. I work in the defense sector in the DC area. I'm also an instructor. I teach, there's an institute at my company, so I teach a full day program on strategic communication, storycraft, and writing for both employees and members of the government. So I never thought I'd want to be a teacher because I'm a very impatient person, but I actually get a lot of pleasure of like giving people those tools. And as a side note, I think, it's also really important for veterans to be able to tell their own stories. I think there's a lot of, therapeutic value to that. And I know that there are organizations that are, doing that and giving veterans that training. Yeah, so just going back a little bit to my origin story. So I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Maryland. And when I was a teenager, I immigrated to Israel during the Second Intifada. Great timing. So by the time I was 19, I was in a direct PhD program as a literature student. So I was on track to become a professor in literature. Mm-hmm. And so everything was kind of, set like in a straightforward way for me. So I had to screw it up, obviously. Yeah. So I started hanging out with all these commandos from the IDF. I met somebody who I'll talk about in a moment as well. He was a Russian immigrant, came when he was a little younger than I was, and he was a commando in the IDF. And he kind of took me into his world. I was hanging out with all these security officers and just listening to their stories. I was really enthralled by their stories. There's also obviously a lot going on in Israel at the time. There was a second intifada, the disengagement from Gaza, the war with Lebanon. So war was like, it's not like being in America where only a very small population, like yourself, deals with war, but like you feel it, up close and personal in Israel. So that's all going on in the background. And I'm hanging out with, these people from the security field. And I just was listening to their stories, and I found myself fascinated both by their external world and their interiority, meaning like externally, I was like, wow, counterterrorism, military strategy, asymmetric warfare, like this is really cool stuff. Right. I was like jazzed up about it.
Stuff.
Yeah. And then I was also the interiority, like the psychological aspects, these people. I had so many questions. How do you go out into this like world of insanity? Because, war just opens up the aperture of human experience, the best and the worst. But like, then how do you come back to like baseline in the civilian world? Like questions that I'm like even asking, I'm still asking today, who takes care of you when you come home? Which they were like, what? We take care of you,
Right.
That was their response. So I was just like really fascinated by their world. And then they were kind of poking me like, why don't you not be a literature professor and come join us? Which just seemed like preposterous at the time. I wasn't like such a nerd. But that is what I did. I dropped out of the PhD program. I returned to the US to get my master's degree in security intelligence. I went back to Israel where I served in the military. I worked in a bunch of jobs in the security field there. So it was a pretty wild ride, but there were some bumps along the way. The biggest bump for me was in my early 20s. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and anxiety. It kind of flipped my world, upside down. Gave me also a bit of an inferiority complex. So I felt like I really had to prove myself in the security field and do like really rough jobs that I wasn't really suited for. And a few years after I was diagnosed, this friend of mine, I mentioned a Russian immigrant who kind of brought me into this world. In the first place, he was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he wound up taking his life. So that had a huge impact on me. And this was over 10 years ago. And even now it's like hard for me to speak about it. But ultimately it led to the work that I'm doing today. So for many years, I hid the fact that I had, this mental health situation. Otherwise I wouldn't be able, to work in the security field. And I want to say, I'm not saying what I did was heroic or even ethical. It's probably not really ethical. But I did meet along the way other people like me who were hiding depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, like the whole, gamut. So just being in that situation made me sensitive to other people who were in that situation and who were hiding, and I came back, to the US a few years ago, and I do the work I do now. And I started to become more interested in the mental health advocacy world. And I thought, the only way we're going to break the stigma is to share our stories, right? The more people who share their stories, like the less scary it's going to be, for us, because I think every mental health issue is exacerbated by living with it in isolation. So I decided I wanted to launch, my blog. I call it the Insecurity blog.
No, nice.
So I write articles on and about different, mental health topics, anything from like, PTSD to psychological resilience to, transitions and moral injury. And I interview people. So I've interviewed, military leadership, CIA officers. I have law enforcement. Even psychologists and filmmakers. Just a few months ago, I actually interviewed a 2-star general from the U.S. military who struggled with bipolar disorder himself. And I always get anxious interviewing people with bipolar disorder because I'm like, oh God, I don't want to see too much of myself in them. But actually, it's been very healing to do that. So when I came out with my story, because I realized like, who am I to be talking about this stuff? I'm not a mental health professional, but I have skin in the game because I have this story.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to expect because I've been hiding it for so long. So when I first came out with my story, I was like, I could be ostracized. I could even lose my job, right? Like I didn't know what
Security
to expect.
Clearances
Yeah, bye-bye security clearance. And it was the opposite. It actually brought this entire community of mental health advocates into my life, which has just been incredible. It's been such a gift. And yeah, so I wound up being invited to host a program inside my company called Vet Talks, interviewing veterans about complex mental health issues. I was invited to participate almost exactly a year ago in the Heroes Journey Symposium in Washington, D.C. It's run by the John P. Mayhew Foundation. And there was different, panels. There were members of Congress. There were veterans, psychologists, journalists there. And I was assigned to the moral injury panel. I was assigned to take notes, to write the segment, the moral injury segment in the white paper, and then to go to Capitol Hill and to speak to people there to educate them about what is moral injury, why does it matter now, and what are some of the treatments being proposed for it. And then I wound up making some friends, from the symposium, including Tito Torres and his partner, Travis Peterson, who founded the Moral Compass Federation. I definitely wanted to give a shout out to them. I met Dr. Bart Buchner there, who founded the military psychology program at Adler University. I've interviewed both of them on my blog. I'm still in touch with them. They're doing great work. But yeah, that's basically, what has brought me to where I am now in the mental health advocacy space and, my current interest in moral injury.
Yeah. Yeah. It's important. I think we're all looking for with that one passion thing that, really drives us. And
the mission.
The mission, right?
Yeah.
And once you find that mission, it's like all head, full speed. Right now when we're talking about moral injury, it couldn't be at a more opportune time. Some suicide statistics that speak to that. Over 150,000 veterans have taken their lives in the last 20 plus years. Yeah, that's a big challenge.
And a good chunk of them, I don't know the exact statistics, and I don't want to quote something that's outdated, but a good chunk of them do not have necessarily a specific mental health diagnosis.
That's correct.
Right.
Very true. And there's also high percentages of them that are suffering, that have diagnosed illnesses and are being found with these psychotropics in their system at time of death, right? So there's a whole other conversation there, but topic for another day. But I think it's absolutely important that we're talking about moral injury and getting more people to understand what it is.
Yeah.
Right. Because it has such it is such a slippery slope in the sense of, once you are in that ideation, OODA loop, right? And your brain is just cycling, and it's just reliving moments and putting you into a position, and then you're putting yourself into doubt and all these other areas that
it snowballs.
A lot of the mental health,
it snowballs when you don't take care of these issues. And again, you're in isolation. It snowballs.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to know more about the Moral Compass Foundation.
Yeah.
And the work they're doing. But before we get into that, it's how do you see this working? When you think about the idea of soldier on the ground, right? And the constant, it's a much different environment, as you illustrated, for some of these soldiers that are living. It's the dual life of the citizen soldier, right?
Yeah.
And how does that lifestyle bleed into their the other side of their life, right? Their personal side of their lives. One minute they're out, they're fighting Hamas. Next minute they're closing deals over the phone on an international business deal, or doing something else that is not completely related, but they're still processing all the violence that they just had to endure. And you know what? They have to go back in probably 3 months and do another rotation. How is the moral injury affecting those individuals? And what is this? I'm very curious.
Are you talking about Israel specifically or just in general?
Yeah, I think because it's such a more unique case in what's happening in Israel with those individuals versus the perspective of the American warfighter, right? That, from the active duty to the reserve side, right? And even National Guard, much different from what the experiences are in Israel. And I'm just curious how the moral injury versus those cultures exist and the style of fighting.
Yeah. It's interesting. First of all, moral injury isn't something that usually impacts people until they leave the combat zone, right? It's usually something they come back to the civilian world and then things start to impact them. Because I think when you're in the middle of, everything going on and you're also within a culture that understands you, right? Because there's a very specific culture in the military. And then when you come back to the civilian world, that's a more multipolar culture. As for Israel, it's just interesting in general, even before October 7th and the current war. There's some things that Israelis have harder than American soldiers, and there are things that they have easier. First of all, there's a national mandatory draft. So the majority of the country serves, right? So unlike, you who are part of a minority, right, in the U.S., you're really part of a majority culture when you serve. So in a way, I think that does lessen the impact of shock coming back, right, to your community, is because not everybody serves in combat, right? But at least people understand you a little better. You're not going to be, feeling as lonely. Also, Israel's a much smaller country. It's maybe like a 7-hour drive, north to south, 2 hours east to west. So, Israelis also maintain friendships over years. I mean, from like preschool, and they have, that community to come back to, unlike American service members who get deployed, they come back, they don't know where they're going to be. They lose their entire, social network, right? So at least they have that. But on the other hand, the war is obviously much closer to home. Much closer to home. It is on your doorstep. It is very clear what you are fighting for. And I mean, I can tell you, I have a lot of friends who are there, who are currently fighting. And the country is so stretched thin now that there, are men in their 40s and 50s on the front lines. It's crazy. So it's interesting because, everybody has a different reaction. Some people handle it better than others. But what I'm seeing, not just from talking to friends, but also interviews in the Israeli news, is that, something people have said, right? And I'm talking about people who are reserved, right? They've been out of the military now for several years. They're in their 30s, 40s. They have families, they have jobs, and they're just like, I understand the justification for this war. Obviously, I've seen my wife and children huddling, in a bomb shelter because of the rocket fire that's still coming out of Gaza. I understand why I need to be there, and I understand why I need to do what I'm doing. And at the same time, like, I can't be apathetic to taking human life, even if I understand why I'm doing it. And now I'm coming back, to my regular life, and I've lost my sense of ambition. I feel numb. Yeah. That's what some people, again, I don't want to speak for everybody, but that's what I'm hearing a lot of, like, coming out of the news. People are coming back and feeling numbed out. Also, they don't know when they're going back. Right. That's the other part, right? So they come back to their normal life for 2 seconds, and then they can just be called back up again. It could be a war, that breaks out, in Lebanon, for example. So, it's really on your doorstep. And I just, pulling it back to the American side, right, or the more global side, because war wounds the soul. Yeah. It doesn't matter what military you're in. This is a global issue, right? But something that's kind of interesting is, people can understand logically, and I do want to share some stories, not just from the military world, but also, the police. People can understand logically the justification behind what they're doing, and they can still be impacted emotionally by it and really twisted up over it. So I think it's important to note that like, yeah, even though logically I had to do this, in the combat zone, I had to, this is a very classic example of moral injury. And I want to share also some of the less straightforward examples. But, you're in Iraq, Afghanistan, we know in the Middle East, right, in Africa, that there are child soldiers, and, all of a sudden there's a 13-year-old boy, who's been recruited into the Taliban, and he's shooting an automatic weapon at you and your comrades, and you shoot back and kill him, right? That's a pretty straightforward example that even though what you did is right in the moment, it's still something that could haunt you for the rest of your life because, in the civilian world, it's very simple, right? We don't hurt children. That's part of right? That's a basic moral value.
Moral code, right?
Right. But then what happens when you're in this really effed up situation and you do hurt a child, right? Like, how do you live with that, even if you know logically that you had to do what you did in that moment?
Yeah. I think so. And that's a particularly challenging one, right?
Yeah.
And I think the Vietnam War, we saw, a lot of that. I think the global war on terrorism, we saw probably far more instances of that, just due to the time, but I talked to a lot of my friends, right? And that's probably one of the bigger haunting moments of their deployments is, those moments where, you might have the collateral damage of combat, or the killing of a child soldier, right? Which was very, very prominent during that time period, right? And you had a lot of observers, right? They're using women and children as observers, right? Is it your friends that you're going to give up, or is it the observers whose life you're terminating, right?
Or are you willing to give up your own?
Right. The choice has to be made, and that's the challenge of it. Going back to the Israeli versus the American side, I think one of the questions I wanted to ask is just because of the closeness of it.
Yeah, sure.
What is, in comparison to the epidemic of suicides that are happening within the veteran community here in the United States, is it comparable to what's happening in Israel? Is there does that environment exist in the warfighter class over there as well?
Well, PTSD is definitely a thing in Israel, and it's complicated because on the one hand, you have some of the best resources in the world for PTSD. On the other hand, you have a lot of bureaucratic hurdles to getting those treatments. That's like a rabbit hole I could go down. I don't have the statistics on the suicide rate. I know, though, it's not as dire as what you're seeing in the American military. But there was an interesting study about the Israeli suicide rate. I think this is in the 1990s. But either way, they started to see, it might have been during I don't remember which word, but it doesn't matter. What they saw, there was an uptick in suicides during one of these more intense, situations in Israel. The suicides were happening over the weekends when people were going home to their families. So the IDF did one thing. They told soldiers, you are not taking your weapons home over the weekend anymore. They stay here on the base. And the suicide rate went down dramatically by 40%.
Yeah.
So I think the lesson from that was that sometimes, when you're in a very bad state, you could do something impulsive that you actually did not want to do. And if you have the means to do it quickly, you might do it, but it could be something that you wish you hadn't done.
Yeah.
So I don't have more detailed research on, that suicide rate in the Israeli military, but I do know that there was a study done specifically that showed if you take away the means and take away, that impulse issue, then usually people will calm down in most cases and not, do that.
Yeah. It's a fascinating situation. Right, but in many stretches, and I think that here in the United States we're really on the front side of it in the sense of most of the activity that I think is happening is a lot of the last of the Vietnam generation that are participating or that are exhibiting.
They had it rough, man.
Yeah,
they didn't even have a diagnosis for PTSD.
No, right?
They just called it shell shock or battle fatigue, and they just wrote it off. It's so sad.
Right?
Yeah,
You got the Korean veterans that are ridiculing them, saying we were in blah 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 blah, and dismissing any of their fatigue or their.
But also, society was not supportive of the Vietnam War, and so they were also on top of everything else they went through. These vets were coming back home and being ostracized by their own society, which really sucks. But that's why it's important to talk about these issues and to demand, a specific diagnosis. For example, once you have a diagnosis, you have a treatment target. It catalyzes research, right? Yeah,
it's a fascinating subject. Now, as the more work that you're doing, you're coming across more individuals and examples. You're writing stories about it. You're bringing people's experiences to life, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the examples, some of the most interesting examples that you've come across in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I shared, a pretty straightforward example. Somebody told me this. I was given permission to use this story, but I'm just going to be vague on the details to protect, his identity. So someone from the U.S. military, he was an analyst. His specialty was creating targeting packages. So he was involved in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so it's interesting because, he told me, I create a lot of targeting packages to take out ISIS. And he's like, I have no moral quandaries about taking out ISIS. I'm well aware of who they are and what they've done. So when did things start to get wonky for him? So when American troops were in Iraq and they were starting to get attacked by the Iraqi nationalists, right? So these weren't like your straightforward terrorists. They actually were trying to communicate with the Americans and say, hey, we don't really want to fight with you. We just want you out of our country. Yeah. And if you don't leave, then we're going to have to attack you. So they started planting IEDs, right? Yeah. And so this friend of mine, the impact is the same regardless of what their ideology is. The IEDs are killing American troops. That's his comrades. He had to create targeting packages to take out these Iraqi nationalists, but he's like, whoa, he's like, I kind of get these guys. And remember, he's looking at a ton of intelligence, right? And he's seeing footage and he's getting to know these people and see their routines and see them interacting with their families. And he's like, I could see myself in their shoes. Yeah. If things were different, I kind of get these guys. So he kind of had this breaking point where he was in the war room. He was watching the drone footage, and I think, by the way, as a side note, it's important to talk about these people too, the people who are the analysts and the engineers. I want to give an example of an engineer as well, because we usually think about moral injury and these combat psychological injuries as happening to people who are in the field. And it's not just happening to people in the field, and we can't ignore, the other people. Same thing in the first responder community. I was surprised to find out about a year ago that 911 dispatchers also suffer from PTSD. They're not even there on the scene, right? It's interesting. Yeah. So anyhow, he's just going back to the story of my friend. So he's in the war room, right? And he's watching the drone footage. They're going to, he has to ID, right? The person they're about to target, one of these Iraqi nationalists. And, he watched, this guy being eliminated. And he burst out laughing. He could not stop laughing. He was like hysterical. And this is not his personality at all. He's a pretty serious guy. And they had to ask him to leave the room. And he was having a panic attack. Yeah. And it really got under his skin. So I said, well, what helped you? Right. And something that I also wanted to touch upon is that everybody I've spoken to about, all these different complex psychological injuries, it's not one thing that helps them. It's usually a combination of different kinds of therapies or activities or speaking to people. So for him, he did speak to a therapist, but he said what helped him more was speaking to a clergyman because he's a religious Catholic. And the first thing that, his priest said to him was, the fact that you even care about this shows that you're a good person. And that's why I wanted to frame this at the beginning, of our talk, shows that you're a good person because you care. And, and he also admitted to me, I can't go back to who I was before the war, right? There's a sense of grief. I have to grieve who I used to be. Yeah. I'm not that person anymore. But he said, I feel like even though I still have days where I struggle, I have a lot more depth to me as a human being. Yeah.
It takes a lot of realization to get to that point, right?
Self-awareness. Yeah.
That's commendable. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier is naturally humans are good people. Right. Naturally, you put a person in the position of making a good decision or an evil decision, right? They're going to make the good decision 9 out of 10 times. But when individuals are put into that position, they have to make that quick decision, right? Yeah. And not a lot of inference to go on other than gut feeling, right? That's
and you don't even have all the information sometimes at the time,
Exactly. And I think that's where, to your point, that some of the people that are not necessarily the door kickers, right, and more the the people behind the scenes, right? Yeah. To the point of this gentleman that experienced this, right, is they're seeing a plethora of information, which is probably a little bit more difficult because you have to sift through all the personal biasness, right? There ain't no personal biasness when you're getting shot at. It's like eliminate the threat, and think about it later, right? When you're sifting through mounds of information and putting together target packaging, I don't know how to reconcile some of those things, right? That's an incredibly tough job.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, you kind of decide, like, is this going to break me or is this going to make me a deeper, more empathetic person, right? I think we all, have that challenge at some point in our lives. And, it's powerful to say, hey, I have a choice here in how I want the outcome to look. Yeah. But the other, I wanted to give another example of an engineer, who's in the military. Again, not a combat, well, not, direct combat role. They're in the combat zone. Yeah, so she was, in Afghanistan really early on, like right after the 9/11 attacks happened. And she was making decisions at some point on a very slim strip of a runway. The weather wasn't always great. And sometimes she had to decide, which plane was taking off with something and which wasn't. So for example, like making the decision between, okay, there's some injured people who really need these blood transfusions, but there are also people fighting on the front lines who are really low on firearms and they really need, that weapons backup. And you can't do both at the same time. They're different locations and she has to pick one or the other. And she told me, like, it's not just like one big event. It's not one big decision. It's all these small decisions I had to make over the years. And like anything I chose, like in that situation is going to result in somebody dying, and I have to live with that. Right. And you can't say for a second that she made the wrong mistake, like, what's the right decision, in that case. The other, I wanted to give something outside the military as well. So I recently interviewed a police officer on my blog. His name is Chad Bruckner, and he told me, he was actually a combat, veteran. He was in Iraq. I think about like half the police officers I've interviewed were also in the military. But anyhow, he was in the police. He was an undercover detective, and there was a big time coke dealer that he wound up reeling in. And when he arrested this guy, the coke dealer said, hey, can you just go to my apartment, let my girlfriend know what's going on? So Chad goes to the apartment and he sees this woman, it's like the middle of the night and the baby is up screaming and the whole place is in disarray. And it was pretty clear to him that, the little bit of sustenance that this woman and her children have is actually from this guy selling coke, right? And he wound up going out that night and buying diapers and formula, and he kept coming back, and he felt really guilty. He felt like and he told me, like, logically, yes, I know I did the right thing. I did my job very well. I arrested somebody who was causing, a lot of damage. But like emotionally, I felt like a bad guy. Like I just, what I did, impacting this woman and her children, right? So again, it goes back to that thing where like logically, you did the right thing, but emotionally, it's a little more complicated.
Yeah. It's that reconciling moment, right? It's, it's just you and your thoughts, and that's probably the most dangerous place that happens is the 6 inches between your ears.
Well, a tornado could be in there, right?
Right, absolutely. I think of my own experiences and some of the things that I've had to I've been personally challenged with from my time in Iraq and just
what
the decisions my behaviors of what I did following the death of a comrade of one of my Marines, right? I was in a highly emotional spot in space at that time. And I look back at that and I have a lot of shame to the way I reacted to that and the people that I hurt. Right. But I have to live with that. Right. And I'll reconcile that over the course of a lifetime. And hopefully I'll be at peace when I go to rest. But that's, we all have it. Right. And that's an extreme. Right. I think the important part in which you're illustrating is that moral injury is not just, violence related. Right. These are, you can have a moral injury based on, something that, what's another controversial subject? Abortion, right? There could be a moral injury on abortion, right? And being put into a position that you've been raised your entire life to have this belief, and then you're put in the position where you have to go against that.
Yeah,
that's a tough position to be in as a human, right? And I think that's some of the things that following COVID, right? We are now in a much different place that for the first time, really having these open conversations about these things.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
I find that fascinating, right? And I've said it
Because
over the
moral
years.
injury doesn't just happen in the security field; it happens in the civilian world too.
It's
The
every
security
day.
field's just a very intense petri dish of human experience. But I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember parts of like the early parts of COVID, right, where the quarantine was happening, and if you're like me and you're like, I'm not staying home, I'm going out and do things, like you're seeing people out there crumble and they were breaking, right, and they were crying on their way to wherever they're going in their car, feeling like they had a little moment of personal space, that the world wouldn't see them, right, but and they're just breaking down.
Well, think about the nurses and the doctors on the front line who didn't have a lot of information in the beginning about COVID. They're getting swamped with people, right? And they had to triage. Yeah. They had to triage. I mean, that's also, you want to talk about moral injury, both like in the battlefield and the civilian space, having to decide who lives and doesn't live. That's really hard. And they also didn't necessarily have enough resources. So there's definitely moral injury there. I wanted to also point out, I mentioned I was at the symposium. That's where this interest in moral injury started. The moderator of that panel was a journalist, Kathleen Koch, and she's from New Orleans, and she talked about like reporting on the hurricane there, right? Yeah. And the devastation, and she was witnessing it firsthand, people who needed help, and it was so overwhelming, and she couldn't help everybody, and she's just a journalist, right? Yeah. And she has, moral injury from that keeps her up at night, right? So definitely it's not just, in the security field, it's in the civilian space too.
It's a fascinating enigma that, again, like having these conversations, remove the stigma around mental health and the conversations around mental health, right, is, I think I just read, I think it was last week, read an article that 65% of Americans report to having some sort of mental health situation. Yeah. 65% of the country is suffering from mental health.
It's mostly
disorder,
anxiety and depression. Right? Yeah.
That's a damning number, especially, if we want to, we're two individuals that, come from the national security backgrounds, right? Mm-hmm. It's like when your population is 65% mentally unstable, does that speak well to the population, right? And the security of that population, what happens next, right?
The resilience of that population to deal with, COVID broke a lot of people. Yeah. In a weird way, I felt like I handled COVID psychologically well, because I'm like, well, I've lived through wars and I've lived through some other crazy stuff, and, so I don't know. So I feel like I was okay, with it. I mean, it was stressful, but that's also the resilience thing, because I want to, when you're giving me this stat, right, 65%, my question back at you is, what number of those people have like a real
diagnosis?
Yeah, meaning like someone like me with bipolar disorder, that's not something that, that's an impact from the outside, like PTSD, right? That's something my brain chemistry is, going wonky there, right? But how many of these people is it something that's internal, right? Because there's a very small percentage of the population that suffers from a mood disorder or schizophrenia, but we're talking, most of these cases I know are actually depression and anxiety. Is that coming from the world outside, your lifestyle, you're overwhelmed by the media, especially the younger generation. You feel like the world is a bad place. And the truth is it's a good and bad place. Yeah. You have to decide what to focus on. But what number of those cases are truly diagnostic versus a reaction to the outside world?
It's all very true, right? All very true. Yeah. But there are people out there that are, trying to make a difference, right? You're certainly one of them with the stories that you're telling and bringing more light to the conversation. Then there's groups like the Moral Compass Federation, that's going out there. You're sharing some things with me on what the MCF does, and you got some stats in front of me that I think are interesting. There's well over 50,000 veteran service organizations in the United States of America, right? 50,000 plus. But in all actuality, we're only dealing with really the big six that are representing, the interest of that veteran community. It's hard to get them to focus on some of the things that are really affecting the veteran at the grassroots level, right? Mm-hmm. To get those big organizations to pivot and turn into that, it's hard. how does the MCF, or let me even back it up. It's like, as a veteran, like how do we navigate that space? From having all these different opportunities, 50,000 plus of them. Like, where do you go for help?
That's a crazy statistic. I mean, it shows a lot of people care. I guess, the question of like, how can we combine some of them, right? And that is something that the MCF does. So I'm glad you brought that back into the picture. So I mentioned, that I met Tito Torres, at this on the moral injury panel. I went ahead and interviewed him on my blog, and he lives near me in the DC area. So, I've attended some other events that he's done in DC. He's a really good guy. So I want to tell you a little bit about his thought process that led, into him working at the MCF along with, Travis Peterson, from what he told me, because I think that kind of really informs like the way they operate the organization. So Tito was a ranger who was in Afghanistan for several deployments. He had some very close relationships with Afghan allies. And so the withdrawal, I mean, he said it like straight up. He said the withdrawal from Afghanistan, he said that ended my career. I was so upset. He said the moral injury I felt. He had someone, an Afghan ally who was not rescued and said goodbye to him on the phone and was dead the next day. So he was, in a really dark place. And but then someone named Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann wound up speaking to him. A lot of people in the veteran space, especially people who've been involved in Afghanistan, know who he is. And just having that human connection, like having somebody talk to Tito and he's like, yeah, like I really understand where you're coming from. I'm in the same boat with you. So Tito told me the most therapeutic thing for him was becoming part of a community. But he took it one step further, and he decided to build a community himself to keep that going and to connect other organizations. So I feel like you should interview him, because I don't want to speak too much on behalf of his organization, but some of the things that they're involved in is one, helping the Afghan allies that are still there, because there are still veterans who, are very connected to that and are not going to let that go. And so they do that in many different ways. They're also involved in, bringing testimony to Capitol Hill. They don't want these stories to just die. They want people to know what happened. They want the truth to be told. They also are providing support for other veterans, looking into maybe unconventional, mental health treatments, things that haven't been looked at before. And then being a connector to all these other organizations so they could have, maximum impact in this ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the bigger, we have some mutual friends that I'm working with on that aspect of the alternative modalities, right? Mm-hmm. Of, what is the future of mental health in, on a global level? Let's not talk about, this is global level, right? These plants grow everywhere. But what is the future of mental health look like with plant-based medicine? Like, can we break free of this relationship of big pharma that's poisoning our community with psychotropic medicines that are leading to disaster? I certainly hope so. Right, I'm tired of watching my friends take their lives, and seeing how it's wrecking our community, and it's largely about the very topics that we're talking about. Right, is oh man, I feel bad about that individual that I might have killed in Iraq 20 years ago. Oh well, guess what? You're a candidate for Zoloft. Here, why don't you just take this prescription and come back in a couple months and we'll talk about it. Like, get the hell out of here.
Yeah. Look, I think sometimes you need medication, but it should be the last resort. And I'll just say for myself, I've been on a lot of medication for having a mood disorder. I'm actually not on medication anymore. I've been off the medication for years. It's really rare. And I know only of 2 other people, including the son of the general I mentioned, who were diagnosed with bipolar disorder and were eventually able to get off their medication. So I made some really intense lifestyle changes. I started exercising, hardcore. Not too much, but but no, I started exercising and eating a different diet, really reducing sugar, processed food. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, by the way, the diets that Americans have and what that does to brain health. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. I had to learn how to manage my anxiety because it was like a boomerang effect. Like whenever I'm getting like hyped up and anxious, like that could easily throw me into a manic episode, right? So it took several years, a lot of lifestyle changes. And I think I'm also just really lucky because even maybe somebody else with this disorder would do that and not be able to get off their medication. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you can get off your medication, do it, try everything else. But I also don't think people who need to take medication, even if it's for like a temporary amount of time, I don't think we should, ostracize or stigmatize those people as well.
100%, right? Yeah. I think, being mindful of, everyone's circumstances, right? And to your point of what you said, like, there's a small percentage of individuals that, are suffering from this from a biological state, right? And then you have, the environmental states, which I think that, with a little bit of hard work and effort, right? You can find yourselves, breaking yourself free of all those, the sugar-based addictions, right? That
I would say those were the
rot.
two biggest things was like just the diet change and the exercise thing. And I'm afraid to say this out loud because I don't want women to hate me, but I'm 5'11", and I was in the security field. I mean, I weighed 130 pounds. I'm just really skinny naturally. So I was like, why do I need to exercise? Like I can eat a whole cheese. Women, you got to cut this, man. Women are going to hate me. So my nickname, by the way, in the Israeli military was Twiggy. I know you usually have guys on your show who are probably like the Wolverine, the Hulk, and I was Twiggy. So that just shows you how intimidated people were by me. But yeah, no. So because I was naturally thin, I didn't think I needed to exercise. I didn't think that I needed to watch, what I eat. But if I was going to point to two things that really changed my mental health state, I think it's the food and like eating. Also, even today I have like a lot of omega-3 fatty acids in my diet, and there's more research on that would back up what I'm saying, especially like low carb, like low sugar. So no, that's really helped me out immensely.
I absolutely agree. Like, the first steps of your mental health should be, that right there is, cleaning up your diet and putting yourself on a regimented workout routine, right? Because the benefits of it, of working out is you're processing all those toxic chemicals right out of your body, right? By doing those type, just a 45-minute workout once a day, you're going to put yourself into a better position mentally, physiologically, all the benefits that come along with that. And, we look across the country right now where, over 70% of us are obese, right? It's not the JFK era any longer where, you have, the hard body youth, pumping out pull-ups at the high school. They're pumping out cheeseburgers at the high school these days.
No, that's really sucks. But I kind of wonder if we could do an experiment and just change people's diets and get them exercising. What would that do automatically to the mental health situation in the country?
Well, whatever it is, it has to change, right? We need to do a better job at that. And, I think, again, it's these conversations, it's illuminating individuals like yourself that are, bringing, these stories, these human impact stories, forward so that it's like, hey, I'm not alone, right? I'm reading the story of an individual that's suffering from the same things that I'm
That's why it's important to talk about, to share the stories and just spending almost 2 years now, doing my blog, right? Something that just is really clear to me is all these mental health issues in the security field, right? I think it comes down to two buckets. It's the stigma and the resources, right? Those are the two things that we really, have to tackle.
Yeah. I think of, what was that Harrison Ford movie where the replicants,
you're asking the wrong person.
Big sci-fi movie. Crap. But they just made a remake, 2048. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting this movie. It's one of my favorites. Blade Runner. Right. So Blade Runner.
Okay.
Right? Blade Runner 2048, the replicant is the police officer, right? And every time he goes out and he is interacting with the public or he is involved in any sort of violence, he has to come back and he has to go through the standard testing, right? And it's just a bunch of questions like boom, 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 boom. And if you answer outside the pattern, they take you off the force. Like we don't do any of that in the United States military, right? There's been a time, you look back in the annals of history, right? An old Green Beret friend of mine told me of how the Scots used to bring their warriors back, right? And they would spend 2 weeks outside of the village, right? And they would go through a cleansing process, probably with mushrooms, that they're cleaning the spirits out of their violence and the things that they had seen before they're allowed back into society. And then those people were accepted back in, and they were fruitful within those societies, right? They were not what we see here, veterans on the street and trying to find their own ways. So I think we have to do a better job. Right. For the national security of the United States of America, and just for the human experience. We know that violence is never going to go away, right? That is intrinsic to the human experience. But I think what we can all do is, create better opportunities for individuals that, just might need a little bit more empathy and sympathy, right? I think that's probably the best way of putting that. So, Jessica, I want to say thank you for the opportunity and the conversation. I want to say thank you for what you're doing and all the work that you do for national security for individuals around the world. Do you have a blog? You've mentioned several times that you write about these things consistently. Yep. That is Jessica Walton Writer. That's WRITER.com. What can people find on your blog site? What can people find on your blog site?
Yeah, sure. So they can find articles, research that I've done, and interviews. And I've also just kind of posted some events and documentaries. So for example, I interviewed and attended the documentary. I want to give a shout out to this person as well, Conrad Weaver. He produced PTSD 111, PTSD 911. Yeah. And so he took a really close look at the mental health crisis going on in the first responder community, first of its kind. So I just try to highlight events also that I think are important for people to know about. So I'm just a one-woman show right now, but I have been, gaining forces with other people and organizations and continuing to speak on podcasts like this one. So thank you so much. I wanted to ask, could I just tell you, just ending off, like 3 kind of treatments for moral injury that are showing. I just want to squeeze. I was like, I don't want to talk about myself so much. No, I just wanted to squeeze that in at the end, that little, call to action. So, I also wanted to give a shout out. This is somebody, Shauna Springer. She's a psychologist who specializes in, the veteran first responder community. I've never interviewed her directly. I have interviewed her co-author on another book, Michael Sugru, who was a combat veteran and police officer. So something that she talks about, so I want to give credit where credit is due, is the 3 top treatments, right? So she's a big believer in group-based therapy with peer support as opposed to individual, one-on-one therapy for people struggling with moral injury. Jonathan Shea, right? He would back that up. I think that there are a lot of, people looking at this issue who would back that up. Why though, right? So moral injury doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It's something that happens, as part of a social construct, right? Because we are told what our values are. We learn our morals, and then something, goes awry with them in the battlefield, right? So it's something that happens within a communal context, and the healing process should take place in a communal context. Maybe that's not comfortable for everybody, right? Some people might prefer one-on-one therapy. But a lot of people also have expressed I feel uncomfortable telling a psychologist, might be a civilian psychologist in most cases, that I've done certain things or been involved in certain things. But when I'm in a room full of other people who totally get where I'm coming from, who have stories of their own, it kind of diffuses that. And Jonathan Shea said, with the Vietnam veterans, one of the biggest, factors that led to long-term psychological trauma was uncommunalized grief. Yeah, I agree with that. So that's one. The second one is equine therapy.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And
I think you mentioned that before.
I'm a recent believer.
I listened to one of your episodes with Tom Spooner, and I remember.
That was huge. Like I've been around horses most of my life.
Yeah.
Having that experience, through a guided, type of environment, changed my entire perspective on that. On the animal in general, and then the relationship part, like creating a relationship with an animal. You get about it, like a dog relationship, like, all that. But like when that horse, that bond was like profound, even to this moment. I can't put words around it.
That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that, because like I'm looking at it academically, right? I'm reading about it, but it's different to hear it from somebody who's actually experienced it and said, yeah, that was actually really helpful. And a horse also is a very reactive, it's a very sensitive animal. It reacts. Like, so if you're very tense, like when approaching the horse, like it will reflect that, but in a non-judgmental way. So I thought that was really interesting. And the last one I wanted to mention was something that Dr. Bart Buchner brought up. So I mentioned he's one of the founders of the military psychology program at Adler University. He was talking to me recently about ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. So the acceptance aspect is like just radically accepting how bad you feel about the moral injury. Just saying, hey, like, I know this happened. I can't fight it. I can't make it disappear, and I can't fight how bad I'm feeling. And sometimes, I've had that experience too, when I'm trying to fight like how anxious I am about something, instead of just saying, yeah, I'm just anxious. It's okay. It'll pass. Right. So that's one aspect of it is just radically accepting the situation and how you feel about it. And then the commitment part is really talking about, well, what are my morals? Like really articulating it. I mean, I come from a religious background. I mentioned at the beginning, right? I'm an Orthodox Jew. So I think we have an advantage when you come from a religious background, regardless of your religion, that you articulate your values a lot more clearly than somebody who doesn't come from a religious background. You don't need to be religious to have a value system, but you understand, what I'm saying. But for somebody in this type of therapy, like your values, right, in some way, your morality was injured. Well, what are your like primary, values, and how can we get you back there? Like, how can we get you to volunteer for something that, would heal that injury? So I think there's a time to be in the past and to analyze it and to integrate it. And then there's a time to close the door on the past and to move forward. And, look, my call to action is that we need to keep talking about moral injury because it's not really a well-known term, even though it's not a new term, right? We have to talk to leadership. We have, whether that's military, law enforcement, Capitol Hill, we have to think about, not just how to treat people who are dealing with it, but how can we prevent it? And, Jonathan Shea said, for example, my job as a physician isn't just to, heal people from injury, but to try to prevent injury, right? And I think if there's training, whether that's, in police departments, with the military and the CIA for this kind of stuff, people sharing stories, I don't think you can prepare people for every single scenario. And each person is unique and has their own life experiences, but I think you still need to prepare people in some way that this could happen, that you could face these situations. This is how you could feel. And as Viktor Frankl, who's would say is a psychiatrist, Jewish psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, he said, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is actually normal behavior. Right. So people need to feel like they're normal if they're freaking out from something that really was abnormal, right? So we have to keep pushing that. We have to have that awareness. We need to figure out a way to put that into our training materials. And I think we also have to keep building community and sticking together as a community. So thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some incredibly powerful words in the idea of radically accepting your situation, right? I often ask myself two things when I find myself in like one of those moments where I know that I can spin out of control, right? And it's, am I being shot at? And am I going to die? If I can say no to either of those situations, that means I can change the outcomes of the situation I'm in right now. And it generally brings me back to a level of sanity, and it's taken me a long, studious, practice to get to that point, right? Yeah. The other aspect is what I also agree with is, the first part of that call to action is, I also believe that, singular conversations with a psychiatrist about these situations are of no help, right? I think, I can go from my personal experiences and share some of that. Is, from the period of 2006 to 2009, I went through multiple psychiatrists trying to talk about my own situation. And what I found,
were they civilian psychiatrists or people who specialize?
They're specialists, civilians, a mixture of civilians and VA, right?
Right. Okay.
And what I learned, or what I felt during those time periods, was that these individuals were so caught up in the story of my combat that they weren't even listening to what I was talking about. Right.
Interesting.
They wanted to hear more about what that world looked like.
The Hollywood aspect.
Right. They wanted to know all that stuff. And I felt like I was never really getting to the things I needed to talk about. And the stuff I really wanted to talk about, I wasn't comfortable sharing with those individuals because they had not built that level of trust with me that I was able to do that.
Yeah,
right?
the trust factor is really important if you want people to open up.
Yep. And
totally.
What kind of exhibited itself later in life, right? When we were doing this thing called grunt style, is, I remember in the early beginnings, we had a lot of individuals that were suffering from, moral injury, PTSD, reconciling, some of the things that they experienced in their time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was having a major effect on their ability to just perform standard duties, right, in the workplace. So, we identified that very early on, and we implemented the buddy system. And by that, I was on the daily getting individuals coming to my door crying and saying, "Tim, I can't do it. It's too much." And we'd sit down and we talk, and they felt safe sharing those things with me because it was shared experiences, right?
And you're part of their community. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And within that, so when we started creating that buddy system, the entire situation, changed, right? We had, people's personal lives were improving. Right. They were coming back in and saying, "Hey, man, like things are getting better at home because I'm able to talk about things with my peers
it's
here."
It's reverse snowballing.
Yes, exactly. It's taking away
That's what you want. Yeah.
Right? So there's incredible power in all that. And the equine therapy, again, like that was a recent discovery of mine.
Yeah.
That has really changed.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's cool to hear that really helped you.
Yeah. So I'm a fan of all of it, and as I continue to explore my own mental health and circumstances, and it's good to find other people out there that are providing opportunities and education and information for others. So I want to say thank you, Jessica, for your time today and the illumination that you provided all of our listeners. And I hope all of you out there were able to take away from this conversation something that could be of value to you or someone within your immediate network of loved ones or friends and peers. If you are so inclined to learn more, please go to Jessica Walton Writer, WRITER.com, to continue to see the work that Jessica is doing and the people that she's interviewing and the conversation that she's having around moral injury and mental health within our security force, our security defenses and the networks they're in, as well as the first responders. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be another episode for us on American Grit today. You know the rules. Be kind to one another and wash those stinking hands. We'll see you again soon.